and welcome back to my channel where I, and hopefully you, agree that one of the best things in life is a good solid slice of Warhammer nostalgia. Old miniatures, vintage lore, and definitely old school painting styles are absolutely my jam, and I can't wait for there to be a time in the future where Warhammer is so insanely popular that I just get to settle down into my niche of only painting miniatures from 30 to 40 years ago forever. Implying that I've not already kind of started doing that. I've painted one Space Marine and that's it, and I painted it as a Rainbow Warrior, so But I also like a little bit of a challenge when it comes to painting, and colour mixing and colour matching is one of my favourite ways to kind of flex my brain muscles and try something new. So this video is going to be a mix of those two things, and also a fun little tutorial for you guys too. I am going to be painting up one of my favourite miniatures, this beautiful, old, noble, magnificent, short, old Chaos Dwarf, using only 8 paints. That's right, only 8 paints. But not any old 8 paints, no, because I am so delighted to say that this video has a sponsor. If you're also a fan of nostalgic Warhammer content and haven't heard of Warcolors yet, then please allow me to lure you out from under the rock you've been hiding under to show you one of the coolest paint ranges I've ever seen and also used myself. Warcolors are dedicated to producing near identical replicas of all your favourite old Games Workshop paint ranges from the 80s and 90s, and I've been collecting their range for years now. In fact, their titillating pink that they released a couple of years ago is one of my favourite paints. In fact, it's not there. Where is it? Oh, it's here because I use it so often. This one here, it's great, trust me. So when they reached out to me and offered me their new paint range called Nostalgia 94, I was obviously so thrilled, but I kind of thought and I went, oh, can we do like one better? And can I make an entire video for you? And thankfully they agreed, so I guess kind of technically made the first move on this sponsorship. So you know I'm serious. Their Nostalgia 94 set comes with 10 very familiar paints in dropper bottles and a very high quality looking brush, which is really nice actually. That's a lovely little touch. And as you can see here, which was very satisfying to do, their paints are at least a 95% colour match compared with the original release paints. And they've even matched the labels, the smell, the feel, and the consistency of the original line. So you're definitely getting that 1994 experience, if that's what you want. Warcolors isn't a huge painting company. They're quite small, but they're very dedicated to this little niche which I love. So I'm really delighted that they agreed to sponsor this video and give me the opportunity to kind of demonstrate why I love their paint so much, so that hopefully you fall in love too. And if you want to go check them out and get yourself a little nostalgic Warhammer treat, then I'm going to pop all the links down in the description box below so you can check it out yourself. But for now, back to the video. Whoosh. I like to whoosh. It's become a thing now. Whoosh. So a big part of this tutorial is going to be all about colour mixing since we're only using 8 paints. And I love colour mixing and it comes quite naturally to me when I'm doing it on the palette, but it can be quite hard to convey those mixes like verbally and visually using numbers like 4 parts blue, 6 parts red and 9 parts dreams. It's kind of tricky. So I've created this fun little graphic system over here to help explain exactly what's going on my palette as I'm painting as clearly as I can for you guys at home. If you want to follow along at home, just try mixing the paints using the breakdown on the left. And if you don't have the exact colours I'm using, just try to match them as well as you can using your own collections of paints until they're as close a match to the mix colour at the bottom as possible. Or you can just use a paint which matches the mix colour at the bottom. That works too. Also, before we get started, I'm going to be uploading a longer version of this tutorial which goes into more detail with more painting footage up to my Patreon. So if you get to the end and you want a little bit more detail on the stages, you can sign up and watch that there. So a massive thank you again to Warcolors for sponsoring this video, and let's start paint mixing to paint up this classic Chaos Dwarf. Woo. We're going to start by painting up the Chaos Dwarf's face, and for me when I'm painting faces on miniatures I usually do quite a bit of colour mixing anyways, as I'm usually looking for like specific undertones on the skin. For instance, this one I want it to have quite red undertones in the skin, and that's going to be reflected in the colours I choose to mix when I'm painting the face. For the base colour, we're going to make a slightly more orangey red toned version of bronzed flesh by mixing in some serpent bite leather and a tiny little bit of blood red to give it a little bit of warmth. As usual, when we're base coating, we're going to be building up the colour in around 3 to 4 thin layers until we have a strong and smooth finish. Just make sure you let your layers dry fully in between each of your applications. Now, the Warcolors 94 range does come with a flesh wash colour, but I wanted mine to be a bit more red toned and personalised, so I'm going to mix my own today. We're going to use a dark mix of blood red, serpent bite leather and bronzed flesh, and we're going to be thinning this mix down into a glaze consistency using a few brushfuls of water. Then we're going to apply it to some of the more shadowy areas of the dwarf's face, like around his eyes and the sides of his face and all over his nose to start making that area a little bit darker. Keep building up this colour in thin glazes until it's most concentrated in the areas you want to be the darkest. I like a lot of my Warhammer miniatures to have pink noses, and dwarves are no different. So with this slightly more pinkish paint mix, I'm going to start blocking in some of the areas of the face I want to be a little bit pinker, like the whole of the nose and a little bit around his mouth and lips too. Now that all our lighter shades are in, we're going to start making some real contrast on the skin by adding a few darker recess shades. Our first one is going to be in a cool toned brown, which we'll make by incorporating just a tiny little bit of enchanted blue into our paint mix. And as usual, when you're applying a recess shade, try to be careful and use a very fine tip on your brush to apply it only to the darkest and most obvious creases of your miniature's face. Then we're going to apply a little bit of black to our previous mix to make an even darker recess shade, which will only go into the very, very deepest details of the face, like under the nose and around the eyes, and a little in the crease of the mouth as well. Now it's time to highlight that cute pink nose using a light pink tone, and I'm going to apply this colour in the middle of the nose and keep that original darker pink colour at the sides to give it some contrast. You can also use this colour to highlight the lighter parts of the lips as well. We're going to add a little bit of white to the previous mix and use this colour to highlight the rest of the face and also a little bit of the nose too. Since there isn't much of the dwarf's face showing under all that beard and that mighty hat, I'm just going to apply a few tiny bits to his cheekbones to make them stand out a little bit more, and a few dots just on his nose as well. Then we're going to apply a few final point highlights all over the face by adding even more white into our previous mix. Again, apply this to similar places as your previous step, but this time focus it into even higher and smaller points of the face until the whole thing looks well defined and finished. For the eyes, we're keeping it super simple, and we're going to start by blocking them in using some Chaos Black. Then, using a nice thin brush tip, we're going to very carefully pick them out using some Skull White, and then even more carefully, we're going to dot in the irises using some more Chaos Black. And I chose to have my dwarf looking to the side to make him look like he's up to something chaosy. The teeth are even easier to do. Just block them in using a nice light grey paint mix, and then highlight the ends using a little bit of Skull White. Now it's time to paint the Chaos Dwarf's mighty beard, and a lot of the old artwork for Chaos Dwarfs have them depicted with like these deep saturated blue beards, and since I'm using a lot of the old artwork as inspiration for this piece, that's what we're going to try and replicate on our miniature. We're going to keep the recesses pure black and start base coating all the more raised details using a dark mix of Chaos Black and Enchanted Blue. I'm also going to start applying this colour onto his eyebrows and his mustache too to start making those areas the same colour. Then using a 1-to-1 mix of Enchanted Blue and Chaos Black, we're going to start focusing our layers into even higher parts of the hair details. And again, we're building up this colour in thin layers until it's most concentrated in the areas we want to be the shiniest and lightest. Then we're going to repeat the previous step with an even lighter mix of Enchanted Blue and Chaos Black, except this time we're going to focus it into even higher areas of the beard, mustache and eyebrows. Now we're going to add a little bit of white into our previous mix and use that colour to start picking out some of the individual hair details on the miniature. I'm focusing these little edge highlights into the highest parts of the areas we painted in the previous step to make the hair look a little bit shinier. Then further define those tiny little edge highlights by adding in a bit more white to the mix and applying this colour into even more raised and sharp points of the hair details. Then finish up with a tiny point highlight using an almost pure white mix onto only the highest and sharpest details of the hair. For the clothes, we're going to keep it really old school and reference that wonderful source material again and give his robes and his hat really bright and saturated red and blue tones. We're going to start with his cool scale mail looking armour, and to base coat it we're going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Chaos Black and Blood Red, which ended up looking a lot like Citadel Corn Red. Similarly to the beard, we're going to leave the recesses black to create some contrast without the need for a heavy wash. Then, using some pure blood red, we're going to pick out each individual piece of scale on his front and back. Make sure you're applying these layers broadly, but are still leaving some of that original dark red showing at the base of each scale, as this will create a nice bold gradient on each piece. Then we're going to add in some sunburst yellow into our blood red and use this nice saturated orange colour to start edge highlighting each individual scale. And yes, this is a little bit time consuming, but just be patient and enjoy the relaxing repetitiveness of this stage, and I promise the end result will be totally worth it. Then finally, to each little endy bit of the scales, we're going to apply a tiny point highlight using our previous paint mix and a little bit of white added to it. For the hat and his blue undercoat, I'm going to save you a little bit of time here because I used the same paint mixes that I did on the red scale mail that we just did for the red sections of the hat, and for the blue areas of the hat and the blue robes underneath, I used the same dark blue mixes as I did for the beard. Just make sure you're building up the colours in a few areas of shine, and you're adding a few lighter highlights on top of each band on the hat and on the folds of his robes. I decided to make the robes a little bit more fancy by doing some simple yellow freehanding on the trim. I made a few triangles at the front opening of the robe using a dark yellow mix and blocked out some simple lines at the bottom of the cloak. Then I highlighted the more raised parts of the trim using some sunburst yellow and gave it a little tiny point highlight using a 1-to-1 mix of sunburst yellow and skull white. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of painting things like leather. For some reason, I'm just not that good at it, but this turned out really good, and I think it's probably because of how simple the recipe is. We're starting out with a colour similar to Rhinox hide by making a dark, cool toned brown, and we're going to be using that colour to base coat all the areas that we want to be leather. And in this case, I'm going for the gloves, the shoes, and the little pouch at his side. Then we're simply going to add gradually more and more serpent bite leather into our original base mix, just a tiny bit at a time, and with each lighter mix of paint, we're going to apply it into higher and higher parts of the leather details, until it's pure serpent bite leather in the areas we want to be the lightest. Then we're going to finish off with a lighter mix of serpent bite leather and use that colour to make some little point highlights only to the highest parts of the leather details. And I'm focusing my little point highlights around the knuckles and right at the top of the gloves where they curve, and just a little bit on the shoes to make them look shiny. It's time to paint what may be my favourite part of the whole miniature, which is his big eye-catching axe. And again, we're going to reference the source material here and make it a bright electric blue colour. Now, the method we're going to use to paint the axe is very similar to how you would paint a power sword on a Space Marine. It's super simple and the results look great, so let's get into it. Since I want to, as always, have an excuse to practice my non-metallic metallics, I'm going to paint the iron on the axis shaft with regular non-metallic paints. And we're going to start by using a dark, warm, irony colour and build up that colour on the side of the shaft that we want to have the most shine. Then, similarly to how we painted the leather, we're going to be adding in a little tiny bit more white at a time to our iron's base mix, and keep applying that colour steadily more and more into the shinier parts of the iron. Keep repeating this step a few times until you're applying a tiny point highlight of almost pure white to the shiniest parts and the lightest areas. For the blade itself, we're going to start with a very light blue base coat using a 1-to-1 mix of enchanted blue and skull white, which we're going to apply in a few thin layers all over the axe's head until we have a nice strong smooth base coat. Then it's time to start glazing in our deeper shades of blue. We're going to start with a lightish blue mix, which is still darker than our base colour, and thin it down into a glaze consistency using some water. We're then going to remove most of the paint off our brush with a damp paper towel, so that we're only applying a few very thin tints of this colour. Then we're going to be using those thin glazes to start shading towards the bottom of the axe's blade and the top flat part of the axe's head, so that the paint is most concentrated in those areas. I'm going to demonstrate a really simple power weapon style here, which only has two gradients going in two different directions, both at the top and the bottom of the axe. But if you want to add in more blends and gradients on your own axe at home, then please feel free. After we've built up our slightly darker blue gradients at the top and the bottom of the axe's blade, we're going to focus some darker glazes onto the areas that we want to be darker using some enchanted blue. This colour is very saturated and builds up to be quite intense, so make sure you're carefully applying very thin layers and building up your colours gradually. Then we're going to add a few lighter colours to the shinier areas of the axe by making a lighter blue mix than the base mix. I'm applying this colour very sparingly onto the highest curve at the top of the axe and a little bit to the lighter part of the flat area right at the bottom to really boost the contrast of those gradients. Then we're simply going to add a little bit more white to the mix and use this colour to apply some edge highlights all over the axe's blade. And this will really start to make the whole piece come together and look super sharp and well defined. Then using an almost white mix, we're going to make one more edge highlight, concentrated only on the highest and sharpest parts of the axe to make it look extra shiny and deadly. Now the miniature is almost finished, and as you can see, all that's left to do is to paint in all the areas that we want to be gold. And for this, again, we're going to do a really low hassle, easy peasy, non-metallic gold recipe. And I promise you that it's easy because I suck at non-metallics and I'm just trying to get better, and I found this to be really easy and the results look really nice, so please trust me. We're going to start by base coating all the areas we want to be gold using serpent bite leather, and there is a lot of areas to base coat here on the axe and the hat and the shoulder armour, but please just be patient and work your way around the whole miniature using thin layers until you have a nice strong gold base colour. Then we're going to start adding a little bit of sunburst yellow into our serpent bite leather to make a slightly lighter, more saturated gold colour. We're going to start applying that colour broadly onto the more raised and shiny parts of the gold, making sure to leave plenty of our original base colour underneath, as this will give the shiny gold gradient way more contrast when it's complete. Then we're going to do what should now be a very familiar process and start mixing in a little bit of sunburst yellow in at a time, and with each lighter mix of our paints we're going to apply layers into higher and shinier parts of the gold details until we're applying layers of pure sunburst yellow into the places we want to be shiniest and lightest. Remember to do this stage using thin, almost glaze-like layers, as this will give the whole piece a well-blended effect at the end. Now it's time to define and edge highlight all our areas of gold, starting with a 1-to-1 mix of sunburst yellow and skull white. I feel like this is a stage which really starts to make non-metallics actually look good, so I like to really take my time with all the little details here to make sure everything is well defined and sharp looking. And finally, we're going to add one more dazzling point highlight using almost pure white and apply it to only the highest and shiniest points to make the gold look really sparkling. Oh yeah, and I totally forgot about these little arrow details at the top of his hat, but don't worry, I simply painted them up in the same way I did the teeth on his face by using some greys and edge highlights using white. Now it's time to finish him off completely by putting him on a little square goblin green base. And imagine, like, who would I be if I didn't put him on a little square goblin green base? Obviously you can base your miniature however you like, but I just wanted an excuse to use the goblin green paint they gave me. Also, I used a texture paint for this stage, and I don't think that's cheating. Like, it's technically like another paint, but I think it's fine, but sorry if you feel deceived. I used texture paint here. Sorry. We're gonna start by base coating the whole base using Goblin Green, and I gotta say that this colour is just, it's spot on, I love it. Anyways, as usual, make sure you're building up your base coat in around 2 to 3 thin layers until that colour is poppin'. Then to finish off, we're simply gonna dry brush the texture paint using a mix of Goblin Green and a light bone colour, which I made using Skull White and just a tiny bit of Sunburst Yellow. And with that final touch, your Chaos Dwarf is now complete. I'm fairly proud of the fact that we only used 8 paints for this miniature because I think it ended up looking pretty darn cool. And I think that the Warcolors 94 range absolutely lived up to their name, as this Chaos Dwarf definitely looks suitably old school. So a huge thank you to them again for sponsoring this video. And I'm afraid that's all for now, so thank you so much for watching and thank you for being rogues. I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Bye!